Okay, well, it's now time for the next instalment of the ESSO webinars with our ESSO Young Surgeons and Alumni Club. My name is Gemma Appleby, and my role this evening is on behalf of the ESSO Secretariat and supporting in that function. I will leave the real introductions to my colleagues who are the moderators this evening, which is Andreas and Yvonne. But before we get started, I'd just like to remind you of a few housekeeping rules or things that will be happening during the webinar. And that is to let you know that the ESSO webinar is being recorded this evening, and that the recording will be shared with you afterwards. But importantly, we very much look forward to receiving all the questions that you will have following the presentation, and your questions can be sent through to us, so please ensure that you send to everyone, or either to Andreas or Yvonne through the chat function. And then that way they will ensure they have your questions answered at the end of the session. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm sure you're going to have a great experience, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Andreas for the real introductions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gemma. I'm also happy to welcome you all from Europe and beyond for our next webinar in Legends in Surgery. We created this webinar series in September, and it is now the second edition for Legends in Surgery. And then Yvonne and me are very happy to welcome Dr. Nita Ahuja here. And I'm happy to hand over now the microphone to Yvonne. She's my co-chair for this evening, co-moderator today. And she's a sarcoma specialist from the University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Please, Yvonne.
Thank you, Andreas, for your introduction. I would also like to welcome you all to today's Legends of Surgery, a webinar organized by our EYSAC. We created a diverse online education portfolio, as Andreas just said, containing 3 educational tracks: Legends in Surgery, Innovations in Surgery, and Educational Blocks. And our aim is to bring together young surgeons from all over the world to provide a platform to discuss matters that are important to us. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Nita Ahuja from the United States of America with us. She's the first female chair of the Department of Surgery of Yale School of Medicine and chair of surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital since 2018. Nita Ahuja was born in India and migrated to the US as a child. After graduating from Duke University, she was a surgical resident and fellow HPB surgery at Johns Hopkins. Next to being a clinical doctor specialized in peritoneal surface malignancies and sarcoma, Nita Ahuja is a scientist and runs her own successful research laboratory focusing on epigenetics and developing therapeutic strategies based on epigenetics and biomarkers. She also published about work and life integration, and we are very happy that she will share her very inspiring story and career overview during the next 30 minutes with us today. After her presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions from the audience. As Gemma said, you can use the chat function to send us your questions. Please, Dr. Ahuja, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you for joining me. And I really want to thank EYSAC for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen, so give me 30 seconds while we do that. Someone let me know if this looks good. So,
it looks perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gemma. All right, so behind me on my Zoom background, you see the Cushing Library, which is the medical library at the School of Medicine, and I'm in Yale, New Haven, which is on the East Coast of the United States. And if for those who ever make it to Yale, please let me know, and I'd be happy to get you a tour of the library. So when they asked me for giving this talk, I have to say I was a little overwhelmed because Legends in Surgery is not how I think of myself. So I'm going to make that disclaimer, and then this is some research funding disclosures that I'm doing. But I think the disclosure is the sense of unease you feel that you've made it. Many of you are joining me who may be starting your careers, and I have to say that when I used to sit, maybe, not so long ago, I used to have that same sense of unease, will I make it? And I want to sort of mention it to you that whatever I say is not that I am brilliant or more fortunate, though I've had good mentors and friends around, but the journey in academic medicine and in academic surgery is one that is profoundly one that we should all cherish and try to support each other so we can all get to whatever the piece of where you see yourself. So this is where I want to start. And Andreas and Yvonne asked me to talk about my journey. And I would say that the piece that people ask me is, how did you make it? What is the secret to leadership? And often it's like, you know, is there an MBA? And yes, I have done it, but I would say it's not, there's no elevator. You have to take the stairs. That means there are steps you have to master along the way. I do think that as you start on your journey in academic surgery, wherever that may be, whether it's an innovation, clinical expertise in being a surgeon scientist, I do think one of the things you need to do as you start your journey is have a vision of what you want to do. That vision can change and should change as you go along. It needs to be full with inclusion. That means we look around and think about the community, which when you're a trainee, maybe your fellow residents, and as you become a young faculty, it may be things like EYSAC, and as you become a chair, it's the group of fellow chairs. It needs to have some transparency, and that's where leadership matters. That are we making the rules of academic medicine clear and available to everybody? And that's an important piece. And then it needs to, academic medicine or academic surgery needs to evolve with the times. And I'm so pleased with the EYSAC group because it is looking at doing all these things in its mission and vision. So I thought I'd start with, you know, being a scientist, I think we like to have some kind of rubrics. I'm not sure there's a rubric to life, but here's my first attempt at it. And I think as I think back of my training, some of the things that I hope you'll see is you have to find a purpose. A lot of us figured that purpose pretty early in helping our fellow human beings and becoming a physician in the first place, and then figuring out that surgery was the way we would do it. I think mastery of our craft is critical. And also early on in training and in your early faculty period, you have to find those mentors who, and we often call it at Yale, mosaic mentorships. You needed many different kinds of mentors. And then you need to start showing that you're figuring out some early successes when you are in those right places. So the picture here is of John Cameron, who was the person who recruited me as an intern in surgery at Johns Hopkins. That's where I did my surgical training, and actually spent well over 20 years, first 10 years in training, another 15 years as faculty, climbing, shall we say, the rings of academic medicine, becoming a full professor, and then finishing as the vice chair and division chief in an assistant role. And John always said, find a job that you love and you'll never work another day. And I think for many of us in cancer surgery, we always feel like we hit upon that magical balance, that this is a great job. The patients are, the field is very rewarding. The surgeries can be as complex as you like, or can be, you can be research, you can be ambulatory. And to me, Surg-Onc has always been a field that has allowed us to express both our intellectual creativity as well as the patient and relationship that I think many of us feel strongly about. So again, this is just showing some of the field that, you know, I've done a lot of sarcoma surgeries, and of course there's the technical expertise, but the other part I think we would all say in cancer as surgical oncologists is we love our patient interactions and seeing our patients for their surveillance visits. The other part that I think is important to piece is that at least in academics, we reward a niche or developing expertise. And for me, for much of my life, it has been as a bench scientist, as a surgeon scientist. And during my training, as I mentioned, it was roughly about 10 years. And as many of the academic programs, I trained under the Halstead residency, and we were steeped in surgical training paradigm. And part of the Halstead training program is period of scholarly development. I did 3 years in the laboratory in my training under a T32, and I was fortunate to be trained with Steve Balin, who's shown on the top right. Steve is one of the fathers of epigenetics, which at that time, when I was looking at it, was a very new field. But as I was looking at I was fortunate to have many accomplished scientists, but the field itself struck me as something that made a lot of connections to me, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. But the other part was I came with a question of how can cancer care be improved? So on the right, you see what epigenetics is. It's part of normal development and how we make tissue-specific expression despite having a normal genome and the same genome everywhere. And there are various marks that can be in the epigenetic arena. Some we have known for a long time, like DNA methylation, and newer marks like how we affect the proteins and how we open and close genes and chromosomes to turn on expression. It is a heritable mark, and cancer and disease uses this epigenetic modifications along with genetic things like mutations to drive diseases. And on the left, you see that a lot of our diseases start as we get older. So they're diseases of aging, whether it's cancer or cardiac disease. And that was one of my first questions. How does epigenetics affect diseases of aging? This is the mark we used initially, which is methylation, very quick, 30 seconds on. It is a way of a normal epigenome. There are certain marks, which shows on the top, which are green around promoters. And then during carcinogenesis, those marks become red or methylated and can turn genes on. Obviously, I've skipped a lot of details, but it's marks that get put on. And the key part in it is equivalent to mutations in turning off genes. So the area I focused in, and this is part of maybe pearl number one, when you define a niche and make quick an area of research or clinical, it's hard enough balancing two things, and you need to say, well, where can I focus? And then early on, I focused on colorectal cancer because my laboratory was next to Bert Vogelstein, who was the father of genetics and had, this is what's often facetiously known as the Vogelgram, or that colon cancer progresses in a stepwise progression. My question was very simple. What is epigenetic progression during colorectal carcinogenesis? This is what I started asking as a lab resident. And this is showing with aging that a lot of genes get silenced. We showed this in using older technologies. These are papers when I was a postdoc showing using things like southern blots, which is where you look at a gene at a time, that as we get older, genes get silenced and aging itself sets up a field defect that then as genetic or epigenetic drivers come in, get us to cancer. So that was idea number one. And we then did that in many papers and said not only aging, but if you have chronic inflammation, whether it's an inflammatory bowel disease or in hepatitis, etc., you can start to see those same, it accelerates that field defect and kind of poisons you for further carcinogenesis. We then said, well, yes, that's a field defect, but what are the epigenetic drivers that get you to cancer? These are really old papers that have thousands and thousands of citations. But here's a gene that causes Lynch syndrome when it's given as a germline, and you call it Lynch syndrome. But many patients acquire silencing of MLH1, which is a mismatch repair by epigenetic silencing. So you get Lynch-like cancers. And we said, well, you can have epigenetic drivers of cancers. And then we went on to do whole genomic sort of whole genome strategies, that this is a very common methodology, and defined a new classification for colorectal cancer, that you can have aging related changes that set up a field defect, and then you can have epigenetic drivers. And we call these a new classifications called CIMP, or CpG island methylator phenotype, that is now part of the nomenclature. And we now know that if you're very epigenetically driven, you are more likely to be BRAF mutated, you're less likely to respond to FOLFOX, you're more likely to be right-sided, and you're more likely to be an older patient. So that I didn't know, and I did this in the 90s, but in the next 20 years, those revelations have happened, some from my laboratory and some from other groups globally. So this is all in the residency period, and I was very good at figuring this out, right place. Also, I have to recognize that. But I think the other part, this is pearl number two, that when you train in residency and then you have a break as a scientist, and for me, that break was at least 5 years. And in a research space, that is eons or epochs. You've crossed to another millennium, because no longer were we doing southern blots, we were on genomic strategies. And that's unfortunately part of how we manage ourselves. And I had to figure out, how do I do two things? Not only working as a faculty, as a cancer surgeon, you do have to develop a niche and become known. You have to learn to act independently. So you have to find a focus and become a master. Clinical always comes first, even though you may have lots of protected time. And the other pro was you have to learn what to negotiate for. When I negotiated for this job with Julie Freischlag, who has been an incredible role model, friend, sponsor for various parts of my life. She had just come in as the 3rd female chair of surgery in the world. And I negotiated for putting my office in the lab, not for money, not for salary. I negotiated to put me in with my peers and my mentors. Some of the other parts is you have to understand how your organization rewards you. What is academia and those are unique to each of your organizations globally. I think calendar and self-management are poorly rated things, and we don't teach them enough, because in residency, someone is looking out for us, but when we become faculty, we are managing a business of ourselves. And at the end of the day, whatever we do, it's managing ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that if you're in a terrible, toxic environment, you can manage yourself. But if you chose a good institution that rewards it, then a lot of it is figuring out what do you value, because you cannot value everything. And I think you'll get the pieces about academic success. It's values and people, and not, technical expertise. Yes, technical is important, but there are many other things that go to success. So as you look in your early years of your faculty, I think this is a hard part. We don't talk enough about it. This is where all of you are. I think establishing independence and showing that you're a master of something in clinical arena is critically important. It is hard, and we need to make it easier, and we don't need to keep the rules so hidden. I think the other part of this is, as surgeons, we are at a disadvantage compared to our medical physicians who have more management control over their lives. So we have to think strategically and work as teams. Teams when we work clinically, teams when we do research. That's the only way to scale success. On the flip side, surgeons bring a lot of big picture thinking and are always good at managing under a crisis. So we bring that to our teams, but how do we then teach these lessons in wherever you may be in, whichever part of the globe you may be in? So here's my story, and I don't think this can be taken across for any others. I think there's a lot of, I did not start my life thinking I was going to run programs. It came sometimes out of necessity, but I recognized that the first lesson was that if I wanted to run a lab and be a surgeon, I needed to get help, lots of it. And that's a team. So once I figured that in the laboratory, that's how I started my clinical programs. I first started a program in sarcoma only because it didn't exist at Hopkins and there was an opening. At that time, there were many, many hepatobiliary surgeons in my department, yet there was no one focusing on sarcoma. And so I sensed a need and said, well, there's no one who's leading this. And I went to my boss, Steve Leach, and said, can I run sarcomas? And I did not get a lot of resources, but I got their blessings. And then, there was a desire by my peers in various fields to do this. And we recognized that all of us could support each other. And that lesson then went to many other programs. I met Dr. Brandel Andreas in a hypec meeting, peritoneal surface malignancy. We used the same lesson. And in same lesson in developing gastric cancer program. I think the question number 2 that came in is, our medical partners and scientists desperately want that. They want what we bring in surgery and wanted to work with us to do the research, the translational research, something that's called bench to bedside. And they really wanted that. The part that's sometimes challenging is how do we devote time to it beyond being biobanking? That is, are we contributing intellectually to the right questions that need to be asked? And that is scale. Once you become a master of your technical arena, how to do the cases, how to take your patients postoperatively, the scale comes in, getting in with teams and starting to do this. And this typically, it takes a few years. I know a lot of my faculty get very frustrated. They want it in year 2, and I'm like, be patient, it takes time. You have to show your own track record that you can do this, and it will happen. And eventually you will actually really get good at it. Same thing in my laboratory, focusing on, very mechanistic science when I have the best in the country right around me was not smart. So we aptly decided to focus on translational arena. And Steve Balin wanted that because he said, I have a lot of postdocs and PhDs who do the mechanistic, but I need a partner who can then focus on the clinical applications. And we focus on things on like early detections, biomarkers for prognosis. And what I will spend a little bit of time, this is another part of vision, that the reason I was very interested in epigenetics is epigenetics modifications are at least reversible in the laboratory. And my dream was, can I take it and cure cancer? Silly, simplistic, idealistic, but you have to have a dream. And of course, our methodology has gotten more and more complex. We now do systems biologies. I use every kind of genome, expressomes, proteomes, etc., immunomes, and use a lot of different models. And you can see the number of cancers we've gone into has gotten expanded as the team has become bigger over time. So early on, as I became a faculty, I kind of used my same, shall we say, tools of, well, if I can figure out what is important in colon cancer, can I do it in many other cancers? And now the technology was better. We could use more whole genome-wide strategy using expression arrays. And we wrote many, many papers on epigenetic drivers in many common cancers, again, collaborating with people all around the globe because, you can't do everything by yourself. So it scaled. We did this in early detection. This is in stool DNA. It was coming along, and this is a wonderful collaboration I have to this day in Maastricht University, and we continue to look at, we did many papers on stool DNA for colon cancer detection, and here showing one mark showing that it's very important in colon cancer. I'm going to skim through a lot of this as more principles. We then use the same lessons in liquid biopsies. We didn't call it liquid, but we said, can we do this in blood? Again, collaborating across biomedical engineers at the physics school at Hopkins, along with national and international collaborators who had the repositories for us to do it in colon. And then we switched to pancreas cancer because recognizing that pancreas cancer was a lethal cancer and early detection was our only venue for figuring out and improving survival. Here's the critical part. Only surgeons and clinicians understand that this is where those questions are. So once you get the tools for doing research, you can also ask questions that you are uniquely poised to do this. And we asked these questions around, about 12, 13 years ago, and then said, well, if you can detect liquid biopsies, can we take it to the bedside? And here's my disclaimer. This is Cepheid, so please understand we've licensed it to them, but they are able to do this in microbiology, and we partnered with them because for me, it was bringing things to the bedside for our patients and not something that can be only done in academic quaternary centers like Yale, Hopkins, Penn, Netherlands, Leiden Institute, that it should be available to everybody. And a blood test can be available globally. So that was, again, having a vision and some beliefs. It's the North Star. And here's what it tells you, how long it takes, and we're still trying to do this. We started doing this in 2010, our first paper, and we're still doing this in pancreas cancer. And it takes a long time to make a vision a reality. There are many hurdles along the way. I call this, it's a jungle gym. Sometimes we take wrong detours, but the journey continues. And we're now looking at point of care testing. Can I take this into all over the world? I don't know if I'll succeed, but there's a vision in this principle. The other part I said was epigenetic therapy can be cure cancers. And certainly, as I mentioned, the DNA methylation marks are reversible. There are drugs like azacitidine and others that reverse the methylation mark. And they are now approved. Early in the 21st century, they were approved for all these liquid tumors. And we were watching this, and then we said, can we do this in solid tumors? So I started doing this research. This is showing in colon cancer that we can give this drugs in vivo in many tumor types. In this cancer cell paper, we did it in breast, colon, and lung, again in collaboration, and showed that you could do it safely because we're changing the epigenome, and you could see responses. And this is like the science and how it may happen. Again, we're not going to talk about it today. So in 2008, we then had our first victory, the Stand Up to Cancer, where I led the colon cancer trials and breast cancer as the scientific leader, but partnered with clinicians. And this is the team and all the sites. This was done across the globe and was kind of taught us a lot of lessons in how you work across the globe with scientists and clinicians. And the trials took many years. You can see we started in 2008. The first trials with these drugs got published 9 years later. So again, it's not a quick, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And we have then used this for many, many clinical trials, and we've done 51 clinical trials. You can see the productivity. This is not me being sort of talking about me, but all the support that exists for us in academic medicine to go along and do this. So this is what I want to spend about the last 5 to 7 minutes about what is it in academic surgery. As I started, it's a joy to be a surgeon. We are respected by our patients, by our community. And in some ways, people talk about a lot about work-life balance, but it's what gives us purpose and meaning in life is having passion and vocational courage. That as human beings, we want to make a difference. And as surgeons, we come in every day to want to make a difference. And how do we keep that alive and true? And it's not just following passions. In America, we tell our kids, go follow your passions. Passions is not enough. You need to have purpose. And I think at least in academic surgery and surgical oncology, the purpose is pretty clear. You're helping cancer patients. What better purpose is there in life than to help our patients take something that is brutal and get them through that journey, whether it's as a master clinician, one patient at a time, or as a physician scientist, or whatever road you may take. I do think that at some point we see this, that surgeons and all of us kind of figure out the I journey and want to go do a V journey. That is, you've kind of scaled, and in my case, I was a chief, I was a vice chair, I was doing stuff, but you also feel the need to scale it a little bigger. And this is the other part of academia, that we constantly reinvent ourselves. When we first start as faculty, this is mid-career. Certainly in America, it seems to happen as we reach the professor mark. In different countries, it may be different. And I think we reinvent ourselves at the other end of our life as we look at retirement, and we need to create that as a seamless glide path. And certainly in my case, I had to reinvent myself and find purpose in service, because although I loved operating, I was also seeing that life was perhaps harder and the rules were not clear. And although there's a stair, the stair should be obvious and there should be helping hands around it. And that it should be inclusive and it should not be so hidden a secret. So if you want to do it, you can go all the way to the top. If you want to stop and be a busy surgeon but don't want to do leadership, you can stop. So that desire, what's often known as to help others change surgery, change the paradigm of how we lead our physicians, who are some of the best in the world, who have trained for a long period of time. But then you see academia, and sometimes the rules are really hard. How do we make it clear? So that was for me the purpose to become a chair. To how do I prepare residents better for life after surgery? How do we make academia exciting to young people so they don't see it as extra hours in their life and on weekends and night? How do we close the gender gap? Surgery now is approaching 50% in residency, yet as leaders, you still like to mention that I am I'm the first female chair of Yale in 200 years. There's only 22 of us. It should stop being an issue. How do we do that? If we wait for our current methodology, it'll be 2097 by the time we close the gap. How do we support our people who want to do science? It's really hard. How do we create a culture that supports an out-of-the-box thinking while we play by the rules? Because surgery hasn't changed much from the Halsted training paradigm. Are there better ways as we look at 21st surgery? And how do we act out and act on our frustrations and experience to make the world a better place and make a difference? That were some of the questions. I don't have all the answers. I do think leadership has to exist. It has to be compassionate. This is pre-COVID picture of most of my department. It's gotten bigger since then, but it's a big department. We have 5 residencies. And those were the drivers, again, of a North Star. And some of the things are, it has to be inclusive. It has to be transparent. You can see that. We do a lot in transparency. We do support our physicians, scientists, just as we support our educators in getting advanced degrees. But I'm not sure I have the answer any more than other leaders do. And I think answers come from the people who are in the beginning of the careers, from all of you, with the wisdom and knowledge of some of us who have traversed it. And I think the other part is leadership, or whatever you take. If COVID hasn't taught us anything, that we don't have a playbook for what the world may be changing us to. It is changing, and we need to think about different types of leaders. This is my last slide. This is an insight piece I wrote for the AAMC, which is the group that kind of thinks about academic medicine, and we're all academic physicians. And I just said that not one of us has all the answers, but together we can accelerate enormous positive changes. That is what the pandemic has shown us, that by working together, we can build a more contemporary and compassionate future for academic medicine. Where are those changes needed? We talked about women. We talked about physician scientists. We talked about discrimination and harassment that still exists in surgery, or the disparities that exist. These are all fields you can all make a difference and be a leader. These are all my collaborators. I wouldn't be here. And this is parting thoughts for you all. What can you do as you start your journey? Find your North Star, become a master, make a support system. Absolutely critical. If you fail, it's okay. Do it again, do it better. Stop worrying about your inner critic. We all were in your shoes. Say yes to opportunities, pay it forward, and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for this talk, and we'll open it up to questions. I'm going to take this down and stop sharing.
Thank you so much for your great and very inspiring words, Dr. Ahuja. I would like to discuss a little bit on female leadership, if we can. You already touched upon it in your presentation. So how can we get more female surgeons in leadership position? Is it just a matter of time? I think it's not, but what do we need more than just time?
So, let's look at, if it was just a matter of time, look at your fields that are majority female. Look at pediatrics, look at some of the other fields. There's still a gap. Look at many other fields. So it will not, and this is not to say anyone is malintentioned. But if you're going to do it, I think something has to be done by our societies, by our schools, by our leadership to think about how to be proactively change it. I took this out. I was going to put this. There are some countries, Germany has tried doing this, look at, companies, Fortune 500, same problems. There are many, companies, there are 80% women, yet the leadership looks really different. And some people are starting to sort of almost force some levels of accountability for our leadership, almost a leadership scorecard. So there was a nice article in Harvard Business Review recently on gender proportionality, and you can use it for URM or anything else, that if you're starting at 50% on the level below, then what should the level above look like, right? So almost like we're very scientific. Why not think about it as science and not about talking about it? So many companies are doing that. I think Accenture has done that. IBM tried. Unilever is doing it. California just put it on their corporate boards that the boards needed to have, all public boards needed to have women. I know it goes against our idea of democracy and free will, but at some point that has to be mandated if we're going to change. And the reason is not about men and women. Inherently, I have two sons. I absolutely believe that we need everyone's input. The key is that you're missing out on half the wisdom of humanity. By leaving women out, you're leaving out experience. And diversity, that is the importance of diversity, that you bring different people who think different than you, and you want that because you get blind spots, So again, I don't have the right answers, but part of the reason for taking this role was not that I had a mandate to change it and put women on top. We still have very few women leaders in my department because there's a gap. It's hard there's not enough women in leadership that we can go and put. But we have to start making that. In America, we call it a leaky pipeline. I don't know if that word rings a bell. In surgery, you can see we start at, now it's 30% women faculty. And by the time you go to chair, dean, it's like 1%. What happened? Somewhere along we lost people. So that leaky pipeline stops to leak, right? So that means we got to start using some tactical and some scorecards to measure it.
Great. So we understood from our peers in other countries, in non-European and non-US countries, that it's even maybe harder as a female surgeon to become at a certain place. Do you have any advice on these peers of us on how to pursue that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so Miriam was in my lab and she's just saying hello. I see her in the chat. And I do think we are privileged I recognize every day the privilege I have by sitting in America, in an open country, and having all these resources. So I mentioned this to Yvonne and Andreas. The reason I'm so proud of what you all are doing and so excited is you're creating a conversation to start for us to discuss what are the challenges, what are the ways we can help them. Certainly we can help them by sponsoring them and giving a platform for talking. In terms of leadership, we can't change the country's rules, right? That's outside our domain. But if there is ways of visibly helping them by either inviting them in these forums or supporting them in whatever way, whether it's recommendations, mentorship, support, to the best I can, I've always tried to do that. I think all of us can take that we are fortunate in some countries than others. That life can always be worse, and you have to just put that perspective and how can we help that. I think the other part is setting some, and this is not about women and men, because I noticed that sometimes in other countries, surgeons are treated perhaps differently in different countries. And how can we perhaps give best practices for our surgical community, for our cancer community, that can be a guide that everyone can follow, and maybe they'll follow some of those principles, right? In general, and please, being a cancer surgeon, I'm always accused of being an optimist, but we can send the right message that, we expect that our societies will reflect our societies in general, our communities, and that means men and women in leadership. And I think if we model that in our societies and in our leadership, then other countries also will follow and will want, not everyone, and I do not want to veer into the political landscape, but there are plenty of people who aspire to that. And what is fundamental is health is a fundamental right that every citizen in Earth should have. And we should think about how do we make that. And it's not about gender, it's not about race, it's about something that every one of us needs. And I suspect all of the GDPs and the economics countries recognize that. So there's an argument for using things that the language may be different for them, but we can model it in that language that they understand it.
Thank you for your answer. Andreas?
Yes, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Nita, for this wonderful and inspiring talk. I have many questions, of course, now in my brain, but maybe I would like to focus, before we then go to the chat questions, about you demonstrated surgeon scientists and the absolute value of this. And seeing some developments in Europe, I think it is very common with the pressure of money and so on, that many departments are a little bit breaking down to subspecialty. So actually they are getting somehow less powerful and less organized in a certain way. Of course, the beautiful explanation for this is that they are getting real experts. But working at Charité before, I see the power and also the necessity of big departments or of big surgical departments, because you can balance somehow your stuff, right? And your faculty. You can send people maybe abroad for a year to do research because others can cover. How do you see this development in general, the surgeon scientist and the development of economic reasons also?
Yeah, no, very good question and difficult questions. I think there are two separate questions. I think the surgeon scientist question comes up all the time. And what should our training paradigm be, and is there a need? Obviously, I'm for the pro surgeon scientist track. I've written about it. I believe that there is an advantage of having a surgical mind into answering questions. I think the challenge there has been that what questions do we answer better than others? And we have not done a good job of refining that clearly for all of us. I don't think us handling everything is the right way. I think some of the other pieces are comes to the level above me of people who control universities and who control whether it's a dean in American terminology or a hospital president has to think about what does the surgeon bring, because surgeons really bring a lot of money, and that there's a bias to have us not do science. The things we can clearly say is that try to pick fields and questions that align with your clinical interest. So you are really, it's a synergy and not competition between your lab and your clinical arena. The second question is a more interesting one, Andreas. I think the question of, as we break up into smaller and smaller departments, do we lose negotiating power? Because at the end of the day, there are only a certain amount of resources in any organization. And are we as surgeons being strategic, or are we hurting ourselves? I'll give you a fair, ENT is in my department. We are one of the only handful of programs in the United States where otolaryngology still remains a division. It's about 15 to 20%. And we have thought about, should they separate? And my chief is very much, we chat about it. You do lose power because, you become a small department. It's great for the chair to be named chair because it sounds good, right? The problem is that there's only a certain amount of resources in my institution the dean supports, and they're going to support surgery. They don't care which one, and they'll go to the larger department, which is the Department of General Surgery, right? So the flip side is look at medicine departments. They have universally stayed almost as one large department. So I don't have an answer. I've worried about it in the past few years. That should be, as surgical community, try to become surgical services and have almost a sense of thinking about the academic parts, but give some autonomy over a clinical niche, which, cardiac surgery has very unique needs from a trauma surgeon. Can we start to think about, some localized autonomy, but then the framework is a big tent where you have, can support and have money to support the educators, the people who want to do global surgery, right? Because we have resources as a big department. I think I'm leaning towards that. I think University of Toronto is a good example where they have many, many hospitals and surgeons and run an academic organization, and I've been impressed with them. But I think that's a good question as we look into now on top of this in America, at least what is called service lines. And service lines go in very profitable things like cardiac and cancer and musculoskeletal. But what is happening is academia is dying a slow death because we're not paying attention to the interconnectivity. So the clinical mission is going well, but the interconnectivity and what is the life of a surgeon? What are the challenges of a surgical life? What should we be thinking? And those are fairly shared amongst all surgeons. Yes, our technical, whether it's a heart versus a joint, maybe a tad different. I call it a tool. But the life of a surgeon is somewhat similar, right? There are similar constraints, and I see some of the clinical questions reflect that. So again, difficult question, but an important one for this group, I think, to start answering for all of us. And perhaps, and that's why I put that it's, let's not keep thinking 20th century medicine. Let's kind of think what departments should look like. Should departments exist? What are those right departments? What is academic medicine? I think that only this global community may be able to offer, because an American vision is just one vision, right? A North American vision. So it's back to you all to give us the answers.
Thank you, Nita. Let's go to the questions in the chat. There's from anonymous attendee. How do you deal with a complication or a failure in the operation theater?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It is, I trained in a paradigm of, back in the 90s, there was a show that they followed us on the camera in the national primetime television on ABC. And they televised our M&M conference, morbidity and mortality. I don't know if it exists in every country, but it's a way to look at our complications. And it was still, at that time, we would still think about it as our fault. It has to change. And the first part is, if you're having a complication in the operating room, call a friend, call your senior partner. That needs to change, in my opinion. And we were talking about it with my division chiefs last week, that if there is a complication, especially in your first few years, where you may find yourself in something you may have never seen, or you may lose judgment. Sports does it. Olympic stars have that. Why do we not do it? It's a performance field, and we should have that in the operating room. The second part needs to be, I know many patients don't like the idea second victim. They don't think we are victims of a bad complication when a patient suffers a complication, but there is some amount of guilt, lack of sleep. I can tell you, if you're not telling me when you had your first complication, you didn't sleep for a few nights, you're probably lying to yourself and to us. But I imagine, I still remember my first complication to this day. And I think we need to then look out for that physician and make sure they're there and tell them that this happens and walk them through this. And then the third part is M&M needs to change and think about what is in our power and what is in our system's power. And if a complication happens, how do we not do that again? You know, some things are in our power, some complications are, you know, happens, but that's mostly, all of this is around culture change. And that we can also set up principles that if there's a complication that's happening, why isn't the senior, the most seasoned doctor in that room? I'll tell you usually what happens in many places. I'm not saying it's your organization, but in many organizations, the toughest cases go to the newest member of I'm not saying it happens in any of your places, but I have heard it happens. Why is that? They should be getting the easiest cases, and the senior people should be getting the hardest cases. Yet we flip it around. Why? That's not logical. So clearly, that's going to be a culture change. And in some places, we cannot go and change the culture. So we have to talk about it in these forums. So then it becomes like the norm, because if all the big organizations say it, then people will follow. So those are some early thoughts around that.
Thank you, Nita. So it's all about emotional safety and leadership, actually, to create an environment of failure where we all learn at least from our failures, right? Another question here. Thanks from Marlene Tratne. Thanks for the inspiring speech. I do need some Northern Star advice. In the beginning of residency, it is really hard to find a way to learn the real surgical basics, and especially if you already know your main interest, to lose track. Do you have any advice? How did you handle that?
Marlene, really good question. Let me give you an example, a story, because I think stories, I don't think you know your Northern Star when you are in training. We spend our 20s in our training and we're still growing up, and we kind of don't grow up in some ways till we join real life, because you're still a student. So it was early on in my faculty years. I was struggling to balance my surgical career with getting grants, you know, getting your first grant, getting rejections, really feeling down upon myself. And one of the GYN oncologists became really good friends and wanted me to started sending me cases. And it was good because, you know, you're trying to build the referrals, and everyone was more famous than me, and I'm trying to make it. And I was quite introverted, and he sent me these cases. So early on, I was so pleased to get those cases, right? It was pancreas cysts and all the things I wanted to do, and it was a high. Now, Monday was our research day, and Steve Balin, who has picture I showed, was very much, had mandated, I had moved, remember I had negotiated for my lab to be in the cancer center and my office to be in my cancer center. And he really didn't want me missing lab meeting. It was 2.5 hours on Monday. It was a Monday, he called me. So it was miss the lab meeting and he called me for a case urgently or do my lab meeting. Can I tell you, I was sweating bullets when I told that person, I said, sorry, I can't come. I'm going to call my partner and have them come into the operating room and help you. Why was that important? Because I was so, you know, I was losing it. I'm like, I'm losing my case. He's never going to send me cases. But he understood. He sent me cases. And I called my best friend, and I had really good partners who then came and helped. But that was, you know, what I mean by that story is one part of regulating and not losing is yourself. if you're not clear on what you want, there are plenty of other excuses. It's a busy day, the case is hard, I'm going to work on the grant when I'm tired, and then you're tired. There's always reasons not to do something. So by that story, the key is that at some point, you have to figure out what you want. The second part of that is not everything can be done at once. And not everything should be done by one person. So I don't go and give a lot of talks about my clinical expertise because there's many people who give clinical expertise talk. You don't need to hear from me. They can give as good a talk as I can. I'm a busy surgeon, but I don't need to do this. So part of that is also regulating myself and how much can I do at one time. So at the end of that, Marlene, beyond having good role models, you have to also know yourself and keep yourself honest. And that's why it's called your North Star, not anyone else's North Star. And you don't have to apologize to anyone else for your North Star. It's your North Star. Go chase it, go find it, and then figure out what the challenges are and then figure out solutions, right? Sometimes the solutions are not perfect, but they're always there. It's never a straight road to, success. The road to success is zigzag sometimes.
Thank you for this nice answer. I continue with Dr. Hossain. He's from Bangladesh, a surgical oncologist. He's asking a specific question regarding peritoneal malignancies. What are the prerequisites to run or establish a hypec center for serous and hypec in cancer center?
Dr. Hussain, I think you may be wanting to talk to Dr. Brandel. In America, there is not as much regulation. We believe in it's somewhat of self-regulation. So whereas Europe, I think, is a better example, but there are some good examples of volume standards that say that expertise matters. Although I don't have, there are some guidelines, the Chicago Consensus Conference, ISGIO, many groups have written about those, but a certain number of volume. Obviously, buy-in from your peers in oncology would be some of the things. Those are some of the expertise. And then you have the operating room management. That is your operating room equipped to manage hyperthermia? Do you have a safe anesthesiologist? Are you thinking about the nursing team? So there's lots, and some has been written. I am not aware of countries that have, but maybe Yvonne and Andreas may know if there are countries that have mandated standards for hypec. There's talk of it. So I'm going to say I don't know, and it's good to say as a leader, sometimes I don't know.
Maybe I just give a comment from the ESO part. There's a European School for Peritoneal Surface Oncology. And if you're interested, I think as a first step, it is always good to visit a center of expertise and to get in contact with me or with Dr. Ahuja. We can always help also to find a center where you might be very welcome to visit it.
Exactly.
Let's go to the next question from Anonymous. How can you find mentor after you already finished residency, especially if you work at a town where you are the senior person?
Yeah, so it's an anonymous. I think that's where the global, societies come into place. I mean, when you're a chair, you don't have a mentor, but I have mentors. Often there are other people I've met along the way. So there's a national support system for finding mentors. And I think it depends on what kind of mentorships you're looking for. But I think societies are invaluable in finding friends and role models and mentors in the national arena. In the international arena, groups like this are an option. In American College of Surgeons has a chat surgeons forum that is more for clinical pieces. I know SSO is trying to do forums. There are also interest groups that are good to be a part of that can get you friendship. So again, lots of different options, not probably here, find me a mentor. The last piece I'm going to say is mentors don't have to be surgeons. Unless you're looking for a surgical expertise, there are many mentors in life. So you could look at the senior most doc in your town who's a little ahead of you in another field who could be a mentor to you in figuring out medicine. So just like the discussion about the departments of surgery breaking up into smaller programs, if you think from a university perspective, the university president thinks all docs are somewhat similar, right? So they're just clinicians versus, people who write English or do philosophy. So there's always mentors. They just may not all come in one person's format. You may have to go and get different types of people. And sometimes I will tell you the best friends and mentors I've had are people who are in other fields. Janice Clements was my first PhD mentor outside. She's the Vice Dean of Faculty Development at Hopkins, and I did a leadership program with her. She became a good friend and still remains a good friend 20 years later. I don't think she's ever been in the operating. She does viral biology, and she has been a big mentor in my life of figuring out leadership. So again, there are many different types of people you can find as mentors through the global community. Academic medicine in general tends to be one that wants to help people around.
And then there's another question, thank you, Nita, from Miguel Alberto. He's a doctorate student of Beate Rau at Charité. And hello, Miguel, I also worked with you in the past. He's asking, what would your advice be for young surgeons struggling between focusing on science and learning to operate? Is there enough time in the long run for both?
Yeah, Miguel, I hope so for some people, not for everybody. I think first and foremost, you're a surgeon. No one wants a bad surgeon, so you've got to focus on your craft and be a good clinician first. And then for those who want to do the academic road, can you do science? And that's the extra training. Most of us want to do, many of us like doing something else. But if I had to say of both of the choices, if I had to be a scientist versus a surgeon, I always chose surgeon first. So it was one of my, what should you do? Clinical always comes first. So be a good surgeon first. The research training you will learn. And many people in clinical medicine can be late bloomers. You can manage that as part of your research training. Certainly MD PhDs give you that structured program where you can do it in your training. I think that is a nice paradigm for many of us who may have MD PhD training programs before coming to surgical residency. So you've learned the tools of being a scientist, if you know you want to be, and then you focus on your surgical career. I think the part we are looking at, and many programs are, the medicine programs are doing a lot of physician scientists, can be shorten the disconnect between both the roads, right? Clinical medicine and research, and can we create a more seamless glide path? So I know many people around the country are looking at shortening the clinical training, putting research as part of life. We're having those conversations at Yale also. How can we connect the two a little bit more seamlessly for our physicians? And there are some programs internationally and nationally that are starting to do it. Many people have tried that. I don't think we have the right secret sauce. I think if we said we can't do it, then fundamentally medicine loses out on what surgeons bring. And I'll say, look at people like Judah Folkman described angiogenesis, all the Nobel Prize laureates, immunotherapy with Steve Rosenberg, who is, trained generations of surgeons in immunotherapy. All of those came from surgeons who kind of thought about topics that no one had addressed. So we can't just say it can't be done. Is it difficult? Yes, but I think the part should be, how can we make it a little easier for those who want to do it? Not everybody wants to do it, but if you want to do it, how do we make it a little bit more such that both the parts don't seem like a constant tension in our lives? And the last piece on that is, please, 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 if you're going to do science, especially in the early years, go embed yourself in a scientist lab. So you are a team. Scientist sees you as a complementary part, and embed yourself in that laboratory. So you are not starting your own lab. I do not believe that as a young faculty, you should be starting your own lab unless you came with a huge PhD background and have already run a lab. You should be embedded in a mentor's lab where you can learn the tools. And then once you're successful, you may spin off in a separate lab.
Thank you, Nita. We go to our last questions because also of the time. There's a question in the chat about what does a mentor mean from Susanne Fischer? Is it important that mentors are also promoters?
Yeah, Suzanne, really, Dr. Fisher, really nice question. I think there's mentors and what like the current lingo is sponsors. So mentors are people you go in, this is like my way of saying it, as people you go in when, you know, who meet with you all the time and listen and know your life story and give you objective advice and kind of help you through things when you hit a dead end. Sponsors or promoters don't have to be the same people. Sponsors can be often our leaders who are kind of putting you up and what I say is make you jump an electron level. So they put you up for that, you know, premier society role or put you for a big international talk. Those often may be very short-lived and they may only come and connect with you, but they kind of push you from here to here. So sponsors, you do need sponsors in your life. Those should be your chairs. Those should be other leaders around you who kind of put you up for, you know, here's American Surgical Association. ASA is one of the big societies for us. So we have to then look up, or right now we're looking at National Academy of Medicine, and all the surgical chairs are looking at the national and international community who should be in the National Academy of Medicine. Sometimes we don't know you, but we're watching you to say who should be sponsored. So sponsorship is different. It's a leadership who does that. Mentors, anyone can be a mentor. Mentors can be peer mentors, can be people outside your field. Mentors just can't be your divisional chief. You can't just have your divisional chief as your mentor. There's an underlying conflict of interest, and you need someone outside the person who runs your compensation to be your mentor, to think about your life without that inherent conflict of money that comes in.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nita. Ahuja, for your very, very inspiring words. I think we're going to get to the end of this hour. Thank you again for speaking with us and answering all our questions. I think it was very nice and grounding, as people already also commented in the chat. Andreas, do you want the last words?
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Nita, so much. It was inspiring. I feel like talking further and further and longer and longer. Thank you, Yvonne, to co-chair this session. Also, thank you, Gemma, for supporting us in this webinar. I would just like to have some final remarks about our next events for the EYSAC Research Academy. We have in the next month coming on the Research Academy focus on grant application with 3 presentations in January. So please visit our website and inscribe yourself in case you're interested. And in February, we will have innovations in surgery. We have Jelle Roerde about robotic upper GI surgery from Utrecht, from the Netherlands. And with this saying, thank you so much for being with us this 1 hour, all of you participants. Thank you, Nita. It was a real pleasure and honor to have you with us. And I got a lot of inspiration, and I think I speak for the rest of our team here and group as well. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor.
Thank you ever so much, everybody.
Thank you.